Amelia Melville's expected role in what was gradually unfolding that spring of 1975 on the grounds of the estate was curtailed to such an extent that she was finding herself reduced to a somewhat ghostly presence, evoking nothing but complete indifference amidst all those busybodies. Yet, not much seemed to be happening in the house itself. Not anymore. Even the various function rooms ceased to serve their intended purpose as Amelia roamed the corridors randomly placed outside time. The public face of the Melville estate had lost its recognizable features. These unkempt interiors would never attract visitors again, she would say to herself with an uncomfortable degree of certainty that was only matched by her innermost fears about her increasingly eroded appearance. After all, her dishevelment used to derive from privilege, itself a source of interest or desire in her mind. These days, those thoughts, they all seemed to manifest at once, each time she was to approach that guillotine window in the east ward, and her unfamiliar reflection appeared to glare back at her. "You're invited to touch," she would mutter before focus was shifted to the outside. Amelia would watch the little dark-haired boy playing quietly amidst the blossom. His sense of duty did not match his age, she always found. He was a permanent shadow surrounded by the fleeting colors of a transient nature. Again, no different from last time, the sudden unsettling of branches and bramble would precede the appearance of Fern, whose scratched nudity would step out of the woods and stop. New black ink added to this watercolor sight. Amelia felt she could see through the little boy's eyes, recognized like before the warm, reassuring smile Fern was giving him. Expect, once again, the complicit gesture that followed. An index finger taken to the lips and the glass steams up. Before she knew it, Amelia exhaled a shush herself this time. And the voice, coming from the woods, shouts, "Cut!" My name is João Paulo Simões, and this is Chamber Movements, an account of the final recorded days in a house of no memory. Chapter 1. The Heiress. At present, the property is partly owned by the local council. Public footpaths provide unrestricted access to the more affluent quarters of the Nether Edge area. The house itself seems brushed aside, ignored by joggers and dog walkers alike, as if the boarding up of windows had been enough to erase the Melville estate from memory or curiosity. It's better this way. Each day, its once traditional facade attains renewed anonymity. Rumors of squatters never raise to the level of concern. The grounds may belong to the local authorities, but the house remains privately owned. April 3rd, 1953. Her transgression was underway as she peered out of her bedroom window and struggled to discern who was who in the sluggish carousel of cars that encircled the property under the heavy rain. The 9-year-old Amelia knew her time was running out, but still her eyes would avidly follow the servants who duly ran to each vehicle to shelter the guests under black umbrellas. Ladies would lift their evening dresses a few inches as they stepped out onto the mud. Gentlemen in long cloaks and tuxedos would slam the car door behind them and rush to join them in the short journey into the house. The next set of glowing headlights would then announce yet another arrival, and the scene would repeat all over again. As it was well past her bedtime, Amelia remained alert to the slightest sound that would rise above the muffled commotion echoing from the floors below. And, sure enough, a brief creak gave way to steps in the corridor. She swiftly drew the curtains and jumped back in bed. Pilar was a dominant figure in the household. Some would say she held it together. She was a slender woman of unspecified age and remained a mystery to most. Her unflinching loyalty to the master of the house, Amelia's father, appeared in the forefront of her identity, and only her Spanish accent seemed to give away a life previously lived. She existed to serve, and did so with Spartan diligence. Amelia watched her frown as she walked into the room and glanced over at the hastily drawn curtains. "My eyes see the truth, always," she would often say with unequivocal Catholic confidence, and Amelia believed her. Not a sneeze, not a shiver, nothing was going to give her away. Amelia made sure of that by sourcing the warmest jumper and socks she could find as soon as the coast was clear. A sense of excitement ran through her entire body while she stealthily moved between rooms and chambers. She knew these shadows as well as the voice that made itself present before she could reach the landing that would overlook the party. Amelia diverted and peered between the gap that allowed her to see past the antechamber that led to a dressing room. Lorna Melville, the lady of the house, came into view, seemingly standing up from the floor and lighting a cigarette whilst talking to a mostly concealed man in a tuxedo. Amelia had always struggled to understand her mother's actions. The distance between them was adequately mirrored in this antechamber that now prevented her from being seen or heard. She did not question why her mother was still in her corset this late, or why her round buttocks were so casually exposed to the stranger, who adjusted his attire with precision. Lorna picked a small tobacco leaf from her tongue with her fingertips and released an unsettlingly grown-up laughter to a grown-up remark. Amelia moved away in swift, silent steps. The term landing never felt more suited as Amelia crouched into position like a cat burglar. The space between the side railing and the Japanese ornament provided a perfect cover in this vantage point over the party. She watched as courteous men made polite conversation in small groups, and refined women moved elegantly around the large room, their gracious remarks barely concealing the youth they were desperately clinging to. Amelia did not recognize anyone, and that unsettled her slightly. A feeling that was soon juxtaposed to her mother's appearance, having come from the corridor behind, now in high heels and an evening dress. Lorna did not see her daughter hiding to the left as she charmingly went down the stairs, addressing the room with the announcement that dinner was going to be served shortly. She mingled and quipped and placed her hand on arms and shoulders in a fashion that distinguished her from all the other female guests. The purr of an 8mm camera rolling made Amelia aware of a man standing next to her, equally overlooking the gathering, but capturing the ambience of privilege in celluloid. She peered at his profile, his concentrated look, his perfect jawline, his slicked-back white hair in contrast with his unquestionable youth. The exact word was beyond her grasp, but she felt he was more beautiful than most women. As the crowd of guests trickled out of the room, taking the direction of the dining area, the man set his camera aside and sat down on the steps, keeping his back to her. Amelia watched as he lit a cigarette, exhaling an impressive cloud of smoke. "I'm not very hungry," he said, breaking the silence. He looked over his shoulder with a knowing smile and added, "In case you're wondering." Amelia stood up and her steps brought her closer without an actual mental command on her part. After all, her mind had become entirely filled with the sound and sight of this oddly familiar stranger. And before she knew it, she's sitting next to him, allowing his voice to reverberate through every cell of her body, as he added, "Shouldn't you be in bed?" Amelia lowered her gaze, resting it on the 8mm camera between them. The stranger took a long drag on his cigarette, staring ahead into space, yet aware of her curiosity, and said, "You're invited to touch." What passes as present day nowadays is full of loose strands of knowledge which modern living neglects or simply circumcises. What was once the Melville estate is now a secluded corner eliciting the odd glance or private consideration. Not many would have noticed the van that is regularly allowed to park beyond barriers outside the derelict property. Even fewer would have stopped to read the holistic style lettering on its side, making no secret of its good intentions. Brandenburg Observatorium, spiritual guidance. Someone, somewhere, must be taking a note of all this. That spring of 1975 had sluggishly metamorphosized into a squalid summer. Amelia Melville felt as she had slept through most of this slow transition, as she lied in her childhood bed, soaked in her own old sweat. Aware of his physical proximity, she turned to the side and time itself melted. "Thank you for coming to see me," she said eagerly. Monsieur smiled benevolently as he sat next to her, his formal posture at odds with the stained tunic he wore over his slim body. She remembered nothing but fragments of the time they first met, that night on the landing. In her heart, she believed she remembered what mattered. Monsieur meant Messiah in his own language, he told her. His life might have been a struggle to live up to that abstract promise, she pondered now, as she rested her eyes on his strong neck and shoulders. He ran his fingers through his hair, which was now a white bush in a blizzard, and looked over at the half-open door. "I hope the party isn't keeping you awake," he said. "We need to entertain the new investors." Amelia placed his hand on her chest and reassured him. "It's fine." Monsieur looked down at her vulnerable body underneath the faded nightgown and settled his gaze back on her tearful eyes. That's when she added, "I wish I could have given you more. Is the house still okay to film in?" With the lace of her nightgown between his fingertips, he replied, "The house is perfect, and you are beautiful." June 19th, 1953. One pictures funerals in the rain if they are to mean something. Little 9-year-old Amelia squinted in the sunshine as she turned to her mother, who sat stoically by her side. She chose to believe that perhaps the drops of sweat running down her cleavage were replacing the tears she could not produce. The lord of the house was being buried, and a vast number of both familiar and unfamiliar faces were paying their respects with suitable contrition. The Catholic priest had been talking for some time, his words too impersonal and elaborate for Amelia to retain. Yet, she was old enough to understand the difference her eyes could see. The separation between all these emotions kept in check, and the passionate way her father had chosen to live his life. Only Pilar, an ally in faith and domestic devotion, seemed unable to contain her sorrow. Amelia wondered how it was possible to feel so deeply, and hoped she would too one day, before the thought of that unexpected encounter a couple of months earlier brought a smile to her lips. She glanced quickly at her mother again, hoping to have not been caught smiling so obviously in such serious context. The sun was right behind Lady Melville now. It did not blind Amelia anymore, but in turn it had made the entire voluptuous silhouette by her side a hazy suggestion of absence. She realized her mother was no longer there. Her mind, a mystery up to that point, was more unreachable than ever. She was not aware that she wouldn't be seeing this woman much for the rest of their lives. Traveling in pursuit of worldly pleasures would become her mission. But the coffin began to be lowered into the grave. And for the first time, Amelia wept. The raging heat of this summer of 1975 subsided enough to give way to the northern winds that defined this higher ground. Amelia's bare feet trembled even before they reached the cold floor of her bedroom. She stood up with an effort, yet determined to leave the bed for what seemed to be the first time in weeks. Her childhood was buried there, somewhere amidst the sweat-stained sheets. Her hands rummaged through the bottom drawer of an old chest, and there, underneath it all, a blue corset regained its shape once it was held up. It was unlikely that she would wear it as well as her mother, yet Amelia removed her nightgown and ignored the frail reflection in the tall mirror to her left. The silent corridors were hers again. despite the wobble in her legs that turned every step into the half-hearted dismantlement of a marionette lacking in self-awareness. A technician comes out of a room and crosses her path, completely ignoring her and her partial nudity. He disappears into a room further ahead, carrying a set of 3 small lights. Quiet voices emanated from that particular chamber, as if the otherwise silent house was muttering under its breath. A tone that lived deep inside her made itself present and unequivocal in its banality. Amelia turned to the antechamber that once preceded her mother's dressing room, and through the door left ajar she saw Messias, sitting at a messy desk of what was now a cramped office space. He kept one hand buried into his white hair and another gripping the telephone to his ear, in a posture that evoked consternation and responsibility in equal measures. Amelia proceeded to the last room ahead, but before she could reach it, a small group exited, mostly oblivious to her approaching. 2 men in dirty overalls shook their heads in disappointment as they walked towards the landing and disappeared from view. Fern followed, crossing a dressing gown deep in thought, before elegantly tying her hair back. And finally the technician from moments ago, putting out a cigarette on the side of the doorway and glancing back vaguely in her direction as he tossed it onto the dusty floor. Amelia found herself alone, standing in the middle of that stifling hot chamber. Its original function had been erased from her memory. What mattered was its present purpose. A light was next to the window, angled at the unmade bed as if to emphasize its natural glare. The 16mm camera remained poised and silent. The action that not long ago may have filled the set had been suspended. Reality itself was in waiting. And so Amelia took her place, the place that was promised in her mind, lying over the ruffled sheets with her hands flat on her belly. She took a deep breath and turned to the camera to find, to her surprise, a small figure behind it. The dark-haired boy, who before adorned the spring when he played amidst the blossom, stood on his tiptoes to look through the viewfinder. As he encounters her pale face, looking back into the lens in shallow focused surprise, he steps aside. Amelia studies his appearance, the age that he could possibly be, the care behind the choice of dungarees he wears, his neatly combed black hair, the sweet abyss of his dark eyes, the detail adding character to his upper lip. She must have asked his name because he muttered a syllable and she responded, "Jay, little Jay with a beauty spot." Chamber Movements continues with Chapter 2, Osculari. This was an audio vault presentation developed and written by myself, João Paulo Simões, engineered by Ricardo Lourinho, featuring the music of Zewan, pre-mixed and reworked by Matt Howden, with sound design and post-production by Mirzuk Avenue Studios. Production would like to thank New Relics, freesound.org, Rachel Maddow, Matt Howden, Ricardo Lourinho, Sean Bynan, and Torregrosa Producciones. Audio Vault is a division of the Vault of Alternative Cinema. You can find our boundary-pushing content online on altcinevault2.blogspot.com and support us on Patreon via patreon.com/altcinevault.